For those who study the Old Testament, some of the actions that God commands or performs can be striking or even disturbing. There are laws that condone chattel slavery, the taking of foreign virgin captives as wives, and the killing of people groups that are under the ban. One story that often surfaces in this context is Numbers 31, where Moses leads the children of Israel against the Midianites, ultimately killing everyone except the virgin women. This military expedition was commanded by God to repay the Midianites for what they did to Israel several chapters earlier. There are some Christians who will argue against this disturbing characterization of these stories. Because God is perfectly good, these issues must be understood in another way. Slavery, for example, must not have been as bad as we think, and taking captives as wives, it was actually what they wanted. When dealing with Numbers 31 and the slaying of all the people except for the virgin women, some have sought to explain this as a type of divine quarantine, where God is containing a plague that had broken out among the Midianites because of their sexual misconduct, which was seen in chapter 25. This resulted in their necessary annihilation because diseases spread, but explains saving the virgin women who would not have been infected by the plague. This, it is argued, not only negates the idea of God commanding anything immoral, but actually brings a desirable result, not only for the Israelites, but for the virgin women, who would not have been infected by the plague. Of course, there are numerous problems with this interpretation of the text. In this video, I will seek to place Numbers 31 in its literary context, demonstrating that the plague was of divine origin and was directed against Israel, not against the Midianites. This type of divine punishment was extraordinarily common in the Pentateuch, particularly in the book of Numbers. It was not therefore a plague that developed as a result of Midianite sexual behaviors, requiring a divine quarantine to be carried out by the nation of Israel. Let's begin by developing the idea that God destroyed the Midianites in Numbers 31 because their sexual misconduct had brought about a plague that threatened to infect everyone around them. After receiving the command to take vengeance on the Midianites, verse 1, the people kill the men, but allow everyone else to live. Moses responds, "Have you allowed all the women to live? They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the 𝀭incident, so that the plague struck the Lord's people. Now kill all the boys, and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has not slept with a man." When this passage is discussed, two things tend to come up immediately. Why is God commanding near genocide? And why kill the boys and non-virgin women, but keep the virgins? Recently, it was argued that this was a type of divine quarantine, as God was commanding the Israelites to go into the Midianite land and wipe them out, because a plague had broken out among them because of their sexual misconduct. In this scenario, not only was God justified in having his people kill the Midianite population, it was essential to ensure the survival of the surrounding nations, especially Israel. Here is how the argument is developed. In Leviticus 18, we see a series of sexual purity laws, primarily focused on incest. Beginning in verse 19, we read, "Do not approach a woman to have sexual relations during the uncleanness of her monthly period. Do not have sexual relations with your neighbor's wife and defile yourself with her. Do not give any of your children to be sacrificed to Molech, for you must not profane the name of your God. I am the Lord. Do not have sexual relations with a man as one does with a woman. That is detestable. Do not have sexual relations with an animal and defile yourself with it. A woman must not present herself to an animal to have sexual relations with it. This is a perversion. Do not defile yourselves in any of these ways, because this is how the nations that I am going to drive out before you became defiled." Now, setting aside the difficulties in the passage with its editorial and transmissional history, as well as how the phrase translated here, "sacrifice to Molech," should be understood, what we see is that the inhabitants of the land have practiced, according to the writer, the aforementioned acts, including homosexuality and bestiality. Based on this passage, it is argued that the Midianites practiced these behaviors, which had led to a plague that broke out among the nation. Thus, in Numbers 25, when the Israelites began to have sexual relations with the Midianite women, the plague infected the Israelites, leading to the death of 24,000 people. This explains why the deaths of the men in Numbers 31 was not sufficient. Even the boys and non-virgin women must be killed, as they would have been infected as well. Only the virgin girls would have been spared, as they would not have engaged in these practices, and thus would have been clean. In short, God was very gracious in eliminating the Midianites through this divine quarantine, as it stopped the spread of a lethal plague in the ancient Near East. Now, in order to evaluate this argument, we need to return to Numbers 25 and the story about Israel and their sin in the Peor incident. We read in Numbers 25, 1-3, while Israel was staying in Shittim, the men began to indulge in sexual immorality with Moabite women, who invited them to the sacrifices of their gods. The people ate the sacrificial meal and bowed down before these gods. So Israel yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor, and the Lord's anger burned against them. It's never a good thing to have the Lord's anger burning against you in the Old Testament. And immediately we see that the reason for God's divine anger against Israel is their worship of other gods. In verse 4, God commands Moses to kill all the leaders, so that the Lord's fierce anger may turn away from Israel. But what is it that God is doing to the people in his fierce anger? What is it that will turn away from Israel when Moses kills these leaders? Now, if you had just opened your Bible here to Numbers 25 and started reading, you might not be able to answer that question. However, if you had been reading through the book of Numbers, you would probably be able to make a reasonable guess as to what kind of punishment God would use here in chapter 25. For those of you who have not memorized the contents of the book of Numbers, here's a quick summary of some of the ways that God had already punished his people for their rebellion. In Numbers 11, 1-3, we read, "Now the people complained about their hardships in the hearing of the Lord, and when he heard them, his anger was aroused. The fire from the Lord burned among them and consumed some of the outskirts of the camp. When the people cried to Moses, he prayed to the Lord, and the fire died down. So the people complain, and God sends fire to burn a bunch of them." Immediately following this incident, in the same chapter, the people complain that they don't have any meat to eat, and they have to make do with eating manna. So God gives them what they want, sort of. "Now a wind went out from the Lord and drove quail in from the sea. It scattered them to 2 cubits deep all around the camp, as far as a day's walk in any direction. All that day and all the next day, the people went out and gathered quail." Sounds pretty good, right? Not so much. Verse 33. "But while the meat was still between their teeth, and before it could be consumed, the anger of the Lord burned against the people, and he struck them with a severe plague. So the people complain, and God kills them with a plague." In the next chapter, Miriam and Aaron speak against Moses. "The anger of the Lord burned against them." Sound familiar? "And he left them. When the cloud lifted from above the tent, Miriam's skin was leprous. It became as white as snow. Aaron turned toward her and saw that she had a defiling skin disease." Again, God's judgment is immediate and divine in origin, and causes a disease as punishment. Now, one would think that eventually the people would realize what happens when you rebel against God, but that's kind of the point of the book. In chapter 14, the people rebel after they hear a report about the inhabitants of the land that they are conquering. God's response? You guessed it. The Lord said to Moses, "How long will these people treat me with contempt? How long will they refuse to believe in me, in spite of all the signs I have performed among them? I will strike them down with a plague and destroy them, but I will make you into a nation greater and stronger than they." Don't worry, Moses talks him down. However, Israel wasn't going to get off scot-free. So the men Moses had sent to explore the land, who returned and made the whole community grumble against him by spreading a bad report about the land, were struck down and died of a plague before the Lord. Kill the messenger much? But we see the pattern again. Anger the Lord? Receive a divine punishment, which is often a plague or disease directly from God. But wait, there's more. In Numbers 16, a guy named Korah rebels against Moses, and thus against God. The Lord's response? When Korah had gathered all his followers in opposition to them, at the entrance to the tent of meeting, the glory of the Lord appeared to the entire assembly. The Lord said to Moses and Aaron, "Separate yourselves from this assembly, so I can put an end to them at once." Sound familiar? But Moses and Aaron fell face down and cried out, "O God, the God who gives breath to all living things, will you be angry with the entire assembly when only one man sins?" Then the Lord said to Moses, "Say to the assembly, move away from the tents of Korah, Dathan, and Abiram. Then Moses said, "This is how you will know that the Lord has sent me to do all these things, that it was not my idea. If these men die a natural death and suffer the fate of all mankind, then the Lord has not sent me. But if the Lord brings about something totally new, and the earth opens its mouth and swallows them, with everything that belongs to them, and they go down alive into the realm of the dead, then you will know that these men have treated the Lord with contempt." As soon as he finished saying this, you guessed it, the ground under them split apart, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them and their households, and all those associated with Korah, together with their possessions. Damn! That'll show them, right? Nope. The next day, the whole Israelite community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. "You have killed the Lord's people," they said. "Really?" And God's response? "Get away from the assembly so I can put an end to them at once." This time, however, Moses and Aaron don't beg God to not destroy the people, probably because they realized that God's punishment had already begun. And what was it? You probably guessed it, a plague. Then Moses said to Aaron, "Take your censer and put incense in it, along with burning coals from the altar, and hurry to the assembly to make atonement for them. Wrath has come about from the Lord. The plague has started." So what happened? So Aaron did as Moses said and ran to the midst of the assembly. The plague had already started among the people, but Aaron offered the incense and made atonement for them. He stood between the living and the dead, and the plague stopped. But 14,700 people died from the plague, in addition to those who had died because of Korah. Then Aaron returned to Moses at the entrance to the tent of meeting, for the plague had stopped. So, what have we learned? Well, we just saw 6 examples, there are others, but we all have lives to get back to, of Israel rebelling against God and God sending divine judgment, usually as a plague, but also as fire, leprosy, and the hungry, hungry ground. This brings us back to Numbers 25 and the question of what God is doing to the people in his divine anger as punishment for worshiping false gods. If you had to guess, you might say, a plague? If you did, you'd be right. Here's how it went down. The men were having sex with Midianite women and worshiping their gods. The tipping point came when an Israelite man and a Midianite woman went in front of Moses and the people, and then went into the man's tent to, spend some time together. When Phinehas, son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron the priest, saw this, he left the assembly, took a spear in his hand, and followed the Israelite into his tent. He drove the spear into both of them, right through the Israelite man, and into the woman's stomach. Then the plague against the Israelites was stopped, but those who died in the plague numbered 24,000. This is just what we would expect, right? The people rebel, worshiping other gods. God sends a divine plague against the Israelites, and when a priest makes atonement for the sins of the people, the plague immediately stops, but not before killing thousands of people. Now, there is a really nice summary of much of the book of Numbers in Psalm 106, where many of the rebellious events that we just read about are revisited. In verses 28 to 31, the psalmist recounts the events in Numbers 25. They yoked themselves to the Baal of Peor and ate sacrifices offered to lifeless gods. They aroused the Lord's anger by their wicked deeds, and a plague broke out among them. But Phinehas stood up and intervened, and the plague was checked. This was credited to him as righteousness for endless generations to come. No surprises here. The people rebelled, God sent a divine plague against them, and the actions of Phinehas stopped the divine plague by appeasing God. This all seems pretty straightforward, right? Repetitive? Sure. Annoying? Perhaps. Predictable? Absolutely. So what's the big deal? Why go over all the instances of when God punishes rebellious people with divine plagues? This brings us back to Numbers 31, when God commands the Israelites to destroy the Midianites. The Lord said to Moses, "Take vengeance on the Midianites for the Israelites. After that, you will be gathered to your people." The Israelites captured the Midianite women and children and took all the Midianite herds, flocks, and goods as plunder. They burned all the towns where the Midianites had settled, as well as their camps. They took all the plunder and spoils, including the people and animals, and brought the captives, spoils, and plunder to Moses and Eleazar the priest and the Israelite assembly at their camp on the plains of Moab, by the Jordan across from Jericho. But Moses wasn't happy. "Have you allowed the women to live?" he asked them. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident, so that the plague struck the Lord's people. "Now kill all the boys, and kill every woman that has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man." Now, having examined the many passages here in the book of Numbers concerning God's anger and the resultant divine plagues, diseases, and other punishments against the Israelites for their rebellion, Numbers 31 makes perfect sense. The rationale for wiping out the Midianites is clear from the text. They were the ones who followed Balaam's advice and enticed the Israelites to be unfaithful to the Lord in the Peor incident, so that the plague struck the Lord's people. It has nothing to do with a plague resulting from Midianite sexual activity, which required divine quarantine to protect Israel and other nations. We need not wrestle with such questions as, if the Midianite plague required divine quarantine, why keep the virgins and animals alive, as many of them would certainly have been infected? Such questions are unnecessary, as the plague was not a result of Midianite behaviors. Not only is there nothing in the text that identifies the plague in Numbers 25 to be of Midianite origin, but we see that, both in the chapter and in the overall context of the book, it was of divine origin against Israel. While passages like Numbers 31 are disturbing to modern readers, we cannot explain away the difficulties in interpreting this text by suggesting a justified divine quarantine.